Hey Quest Givers, great to have you with us. Today we're going to talk about scenes and transitions. So this is an interesting way to kind of structure your games that really gives a nice flow. And what would you say about it, Gareth?
Well, we structure whole modules like in scenes and transitions, and as we talk about it, you'll learn, what took us 25 years to realize what we were doing, you will hopefully learn in a short video. So let's get into the video.
If you're looking for adventure, excitement, thrills, and a dice-rolling good time, sit back and enjoy the next few minutes with Quest Givers DM Scotty and DMG. They're taking you on an epic journey through the role-playing experience every Friday. Learn the ways of the Game Master, the Dungeon Master, and delve into the minds of the players. Grab the modules each month to support the channel and play the campaign with your gaming group. You're sure to get hooked on adventure.
What do I mean, scenes and transitions? Like what Gareth said, what seems kind of natural to older DMs, they just kind of fall into the rhythm and do it. It's from, watching a lot of, our culture's immersed in movies, right? And we sort of learn this kind of language almost, through osmosis by watching this stuff, and not even realizing that we're learning it. And, when you watch a movie, it's not, unless it's an experimental type of film, it's not one scene for the whole movie, right? It's not one thing happening. And even if it's one scene, it's broken up by different elements, right? And so for a scene, you could have, like a big battle, right? But generally, it's not going to be a whole battle for the whole movie, right? They're gonna go to different scenes that make it interesting. So, after the battle, they're recovering after the battle, right? And maybe they're talking about their characters. In a movie, they'd literally be talking about, how they're dealing with the aftermath of the battle and that kind of thing. And then, you'd maybe move on to another action scene or something like that. So that's kind of the basic structure. You'd have a scene, then a transition, then another scene, then a transition. And Gareth, why don't you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so in the last video, we talked about time as a motivator, and we talked about how the GM has basically got their foot on the accelerator and the brake. And mechanically, how almost all role-playing games work is that you have kind of two ways that you deal with time in the game. So you have moment by moment, which is I have a turn, you have a turn, he has a turn, she has a turn, back to the GM, then you have a turn, she has a turn, he has a turn, etc. So each moment of what's happening is dealt with. Then you've got, so that's a scene. So that would be things like combat or social interactions or traps coming up against a doorway or something like that. So time sort of goes to a moment by moment focus on what you're actually doing. But then when you're exploring the dungeon and you're resting, for instance, so if you take 3 or 4 hours to explore a section of the dungeon, you as the players don't want to sit there and do moment by moment for 3 or 4 hours of playing. So you condense that into a moment. So you condense that rest or that exploration into, each person has a turn. What are you doing for your rest? And that's essentially a transition from a scene to another scene. So you have a scene and then a transition and then a scene. So you're going from moment to moment to these long periods of time condensed. So it's kind of like this accordion that you're playing as the GM. You're playing some music on an accordion, really. And as you're pressing the keys, different things are happening and the players are responding to this. And it's this sort of hills and valleys. So you've got the tension of the moment by moment and then the sort of release of the trough of the transition. And then you got the tension builds up again with the moment by moment. So you can start to see it has this sort of musical effect, that dum, da dum, da dum, da dum, da dum, da dum. It's a rhythm that starts to happen. And older GMs who've been playing for 20, 30, 40 years, you over time would have been naturally falling into this rhythm because that's the rhythm of the game. And that's how, it just kind of happens to work that way. Games that tend to be boring are the ones like if you're exploring a dungeon and you're literally going every, counting out 5-foot steps, and then the guy's searching for traps with a 10-foot pole, and you do that for, 400 feet of corridor, that's boring as anything. So don't do that. We are terrain makers, and we make things, and we were the first people to tell you, don't do that. So, then you start to think about, okay, well, what are you going to handle? What is going to be a transition, and what is going to be a scene? And, think about that. You can even think about it before the game, but notice those signs as you're playing.
Terrain can kind of make you get into that mode of like, it's a board game, right? It's not an RPG. And an RPG, you kind of want to go past the boring moments, like a movie fades from one location to another, or because you don't need that mechanic of, oh, my figure has to physically get all the way around the board to here. It's not Monopoly. You don't have to do that. And as a train maker, I kind of stress you don't need to really make everything, right? Like I don't always make out the whole dungeon. If the dungeon is an important part of it, I might make out the whole dungeon, but generally I'll do, where transition type things where the players, maybe go through some halls and that kind of thing, and then they get to the interesting scene, right? And I'll actually set out the scene, I'll set out the room, and then maybe when that's done, they'll go through some halls and we'll do some description, and maybe they'll check for traps and that kind of thing, and then we'll go to the next scene. So don't feel locked into, just because you use terrain, that you've got to count out every 5-foot step in the terrain. Like a game I recently had, what I did was because we were talking about our other video about time, right? Time, the resource of time. And so what I did is, instead of like mapping out the whole dungeon, and having them go through all the dungeon, they had to get through it. Like the enemy were just throwing themselves at the party, right? It's not that interesting. It's just maybe a continuing combat, which wouldn't really necessarily be that interesting. But it can wear down your resources. So I had them make checks to see how well they fought against those, the enemies that are just throwing themselves at the party. And if they failed their check, they took more damage and they lost more resource than if they made their check. They did better. So and that kind of thing. And then I would transition after they did those kind of checks in the game, and we did the result of that. I narrated the result of that. We would go to the scene, and it's like, oh, here the new scene opens up in front of you, after that. So don't be afraid to use those kind of transitions to take out the boring places of the game, right? Another terrain example is, I had this ice cavern, and one of the players got kidnapped. And think about what the most interesting thing about that is. The most interesting thing is trying to rescue your friends, right? So going in these ice caverns and trying to rescue your friends. So the ice caverns I had were like this crazy maze of like, slopes and slides, and it's all ice. So, we did checks to get through all that. And then I had description, if they failed or whatever, they took some damage or they got attacked, because the trolls who were inhabiting were like throwing ice at them and stuff, and they weren't trying not to engage them face to face, but it was like the checks were simulating that they were going through these ice caverns. And then when they finally got to the scene, the important scene of rescuing their friend, that's when I set out the scene. That's when I put out the terrain. And that's when we had our, moment by moment battle, which is really the interesting part of that whole adventure, right? It's not the ice caverns, mapping out every tunnel of this maze of ice caverns, and every slide and slope and that kind of thing. So don't get caught into that. Use the scenes and transitions to enhance the most important things in the adventure, and the funnest things, and kind of gloss over or use up their resource for the less important things, just to get the thing to get to where you're going. So think about that if you're doing terrain, especially.
And if you're doing theater of the mind, there are certain ways to utilize this sort of way of doing things. Like, okay, you go from a room, which is a scene, to a corridor. So traditional sort of old school Dungeons and Dragons is rooms and corridors, rooms and corridors, rooms and corridors. And that's how you would go from one room to another room to another room, with all these corridors in between. And you'll notice a lot of old school maps are rooms with long corridors, because the long corridor is where you're kind of doing this transition. You're resting between encounters, okay? Now, me as a terrain builder and, you know, just a sort of, I like to think of things a little bit more realistically. Like if I was building a dungeon, I'm not going to build a huge long corridor between two rooms that has no actual, it's like, why would I waste all my gold on building that corridor? But this is showing from a sort of, you just think about why those things were in the games. It's because at that point when they were creating these games, they weren't actually like, you know, it was the early days, right? You know, and they hadn't thought about it in this sort of how these patterns were emerging. Now we're talking 30, 40 years later, obviously with millions of people having played the game, these sort of things have become distilled in this way that they aren't actually mentioned in the rules. It's just kind of like you will just naturally start to play this way. But I think that what we're trying to do as quest givers for you as a new DM or GM or flame tender or whatever you're in your game, we're trying to distill our decades of experience into, you know, this is what we learned. Of course, this is not the be all and end all of everything. It's just something that you can think about and how the game is actually going to be working, and you can utilize this however you want to. We do it in our module Messenger in the Woods, where, you know, they're wandering around in this wood, and so you're wandering between scenes, but it's hours between scenes, but it's handled in like a breath. So, you know, and other modules you'll start, now that we're talking about it, you'll start to see that and how that's actually effectively working.
You know, travel, you know, is one of the biggest ones that this is used for. You know, it's like you get from A to B. You know, you don't want to, you know, unless the travel is important, like you're using up supplies and that kind of thing, and you're in a desert and you're in this really hostile environment, and it's, you know, that is the adventure. There are adventures like that, but generally, you know, you can do it with a few checks. You can, you know, or just even narrate it. You don't have to do any checks. So yeah, that's, you know, we don't sit there and play. You know, most people don't sit there and play out the whole, you know, trek to somewhere, you know, and movies do exactly the same thing. It's like, you know, in Lord of the Rings, they don't, you know, end up on the mountain in the snow. They don't trek the whole way. They don't show them going the whole way to the mountain. They're suddenly on the mountain and they're trying to get across the mountain, and, you know, it's caving in on them. So they got to get out of there. So because that's the scene, that's the important part. But the transition of getting there isn't so important, you know, because they'll go from different locations, using Lord of the Rings again, they'll go from different locations in Middle Earth and have a scene, you know, Boromir holding the ring, you know, ogling it, and, you know, whatever. And, you know, they're not showing the whole, you know, transition. They'll have a little scene of them walking or going, and then they'll be to the next scene. So yeah, this is a technique that movies have used since almost the dawn of movies, when people actually figured out in movies, oh, we can actually do this. We don't have to show every single thing, you know, that's happening in a movie. We can just, people will understand what it is. They'll understand that you've gone from A to B, you know, when you cut like that, when you go to a new scene, you know, you're going to kind of go to that naturally anyway. It's like it's the groove that you're kind of going to go to anyway. You're going to fall into anyway. So if you're resisting it, you're just not making, you're making the game maybe not as good, you know. So don't resist it. Go to that natural groove where, you know, there's a scene and a transition, and, you know, it's lyrical.
I think just one final point is that when movies differ from games, or the role-playing games, you can actually use the transition for purposes like healing, for instance. In a movie, you don't see the hero go to the hospital for 3 months to recover from a broken leg. He just kind of comes into the SWAT room, you know, with the rest of the cops going, oh yeah, I've come back from 3 months of recovery. Whereas in the game, there's mechanical things that happen that you roll to see if you heal, or, you know, there's certain things that you have to perform within the transition. And so that's where it kind of sets it apart. You can still use transitions mechanically rather than just completely glossing over them. And we'll start to talk about that when we talk about the structures of scenes and transitions in the next couple of videos that are coming out. So thank you very much for joining us on Quest Givers. Don't forget you can support this channel by purchasing modules on questgivers.com. Of course, we have our merchandise available through there as well, and our mailing list. where you get all kinds of cool extra bits and pieces. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video.
See you next time. Take care. Have fun questing.